Welcome again. So glad you're here. I think this is a wonderful idea that New Iberia has had. I live in Lafayette, but I think it's great for a town like New Iberia to celebrate its authors and its writers, for which it is well known, even to say famous. And so today I'm happy to introduce Anne Simon, whom I think most of you, perhaps all of you, already know. And this is not her first novel, but it is one that came out just as COVID-19 was hitting. And so it did not get the kind of publicity or reception that had been planned. So I'm glad to see, even if it is delayed, that we have a chance to celebrate a novel that tells us about New Iberia and surrounding areas in its early days. I think the subtitle is very telling because it is a novel about fever, Felicité, and the early years on the bayou Teche. Now, it is about Felicité, who was an early healer, and that's a compelling story all of its own. But it is also a story about what it was like to live here before St. Martinville and New Iberia and surrounding areas were flourishing towns. It's traced through the Duperrier family, and we learn what it was like to ride in wagons on muddy roads or to cross waterways on ferries, all of the demands that were made to keep a household running. And so I think it's a wonderful record of the early days of this area. So before we dive into the narrative itself, I want to ask Anne to tell us a little bit about how she came to write The Year of Yellow Jack. That's an interesting story in and of itself. So.
I probably first heard the story of Felicité from Glenn Conrad when I came to New Iberia in the 1950s. He was our local expert on the history of this town, and he was a friend of mine. He was the director of the Center for Louisiana Studies at UL, which was then called Southwestern, and Josh Caffrey is the director today, and he's responsible for us all being here in this room today. So it's everything about this book is about olden times, including 1950s and Glenn Conrad, when I got the first idea that I was interested in the story of Felicité. And I heard about it again and again, over the years, but I didn't really dive into it until one day my friend Penny White, who is a descendant of the Duperriers, and I were driving into her garage after we had walked our dogs in the park, which we did fairly regularly, and she said, "Look at that cabinet back there." And it was a great big metal thing in the back of her garage, and she said, "That is chock full of all the Duperrier memorabilia. All the family sends me the old letters, and I stuff them in there, and it's a mess." I said, "Penny, that is a treasure. You need to organize that and preserve it." And she said, "Oh, I can't possibly do that. It's just a big mess." But she said, "Anything you want to look at in there, go ahead." Well, I was excited, and so that very day I took home a packet of files, and that weekend read the files that I had brought home and realized that I would never live long enough to organize all that was in that cabinet. But the story that was in most of those letters, there was Felicité. Everyone in the family had an opinion about the Duperrier slave, they thought, or some thought, and they had stories to tell about where she came from and what she did. In other words, this was family lore all about Felicité. Well, I was hooked. I was interested in this. I thought, maybe I could really research this and find the real story and get some records and all that kind of thing. And then shortly after that, like maybe the next week, I went to call on the owner of the du Perrier house, which most of you all know as Mount Carmel Convent. And he welcomed me, and he and his wife took me all over the building to every little nook and cranny. And he started dragging out files of plans of the renovations that had been done to the building and deeds. He had the abstract of it. And those two things, I just said, this is great. This is my new project. I had retired. I was working part-time, but not all the time, and didn't really have a passion to keep me busy every day. And I said, I'm going to research the story of Felicité. Well, I had no idea how daunting a task that would be. But somehow I thought that I had the skills to do it, because before I was a judge, I ran the records a lot, did a lot of title work, and I knew my way around all the courthouses. And my college degree was partly in history, and so I not Southern history, but I thought, well, I know the skills of how to do historical research. I can do that. And I was not a writer. I had written crime novels, but they were stories that I knew already. I knew how they came out because I presided over the trials of these particular events. But I had supportive writing friends, including Ann Dobie, who would help me, I thought, and my daughter-in-law taught writing. So I just thought, this is going to be a great job, and I can just do this, and I ought to be able to do this and whip this out in just a few months. Well, it turned out to be a daunting task and a passion to learn everything there was to know about Felicité. I remember what Glenn Conrad told me way back when in the 50s. He said, oh, well, we can't possibly know the real story because, slaves didn't have last names, and they were illiterate, so they didn't keep records. And anyway, it was a frontier at the time, so it was no records. It's a very difficult story. And I thought, oh, I can do it. And so I plunged into doing it. And 3 years later, I finished what I thought was the best job I could possibly do. But I had many, many difficulties along the way. It was as difficult as Glenn had told me it was going to be. And when I thought I really had it down under control, I really realized that I didn't have the answer to the basic question, whether Felicité was indeed a slave, whether she was just a servant. And so, it was very difficult to even begin. But my 3 years of working was a delight, and I think I figured it out. And I have that story of what I figured out in the book.
Yeah. Okay. Did you run across anything that surprised you? I mean, the story was well known about Felicité, but did you find anything else?
Well, the story was well known, except that everyone had a different version of the story. Like even the families, the family lore of one family would not agree with the family lore of another family. And the du Perriers, they all disagreed about what she was doing. That all these letters, and they all said different things. Some people said that she carried Frederick du Perrier out of Haiti at the time of Toussaint Louverture's revolution. And that one I was able to trace down and say impossible, because he gave as his birthplace Philadelphia when he got married, when he was all that. So there were some records, But the records usually served to eliminate the possibility of half the stories that people told me. But New Iberia is amazing in one way. Families don't leave. Families stay here. If you pick up the phone book, you'll notice that about a third of it is people's names beginning with B. Bayard, Booty, Broussard. Oh, that's a big bunch of them. And so all these families, they have their stories. And I talked to all these people whose ancestors told them stories about the early days, and they always included the story of Felicité. So what was surprising to me was nobody agreed. The family lore of all these families didn't agree with each other. And would I find the real story? Probably not, but I sure came close. Anyway.
How did doing this research affect your attitude about historical research? What are the difficulties involved there?
Very difficult to do it. Let's see, I think I can put up something that illustrates one of the problems. Oh, no, this is the house. Let me just show you that house. There's something, this is, we all know what the convent looks like now, right? That is nothing like what it looked like at the time that it was the Duperrier house and Felicité was there. When in the old days, it was 4 rooms on the downstairs, 4 rooms on the upstairs, and balconies, and that was it. The widow Hortense Duperrier added a little bit onto that building. Then when it was sold to the convent, they added all the part in the back, and they put that white stone on the outside. But in the very beginning, it was a very small house. And that was very surprising to me. But when Herman Shellstead explained all that to me, I then was able to imagine her going from room to room and going to the back where past Henry Street you get to where Little Brooklyn is now. Well, that was slave quarters for the Duperriers. So when I had the house and all the layout of the around, I could picture her going around. I could picture what she was doing all the way.
Where did you get most of your information? Was it printed sources, or were you able to interview people?
Well, I interviewed lots of people. This is, I don't know whether this will make sense to you, but this was that shape is the original St. Martin Parish. Well, first it was post Takapaw, then it became St. Martin Parish. Then St. Mary was cut out of it, then Lafayette, Vermilion, and finally Iberia. So the records could be anywhere in 6 parishes. No, it was 5, but then Iberville. They went to Iberville when they were going to go to New Orleans. Iberville Parish. They went to Plaquemine and went down the Mississippi. So the research had to be done in the courthouses of all of those parishes, handwritten French documents in the basements, crumbling documents in the basements. You can't Google anything. You can talk to people, you can talk to the families, but you can read a tremendous amount about all the different topics, like ranching. One thing that was surprising to me was we all think about the old sugarcane farmers. Well, these people that settled all this area, they were ranchers. They had cattle, longhorn cattle, not sugar. and I learned a lot about ranching. We have resources here, like Shane Bernard, the historian at the McElhenney Company. He knows worlds about ranching. He knows worlds about steamboats, and I picked all their brains. So my research came from experts in all these various fields. I even found an expert on 19th century nursing, a retired professor from North Louisiana. She's retired to Mississippi, and she had all kind of documents about how yellow fever was treated. So, and then the libraries, the Jackie at the Iberia Parish Library and Mrs. Gudikins at the St. Martin Library got books for me. They must have gotten 100 books for me from, the state libraries on all of these various topics. So my sources were people, talking to the descendants of old families, research books, and picking the brains of everybody on all of these topics.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the themes in the novel. The one that's inescapable, of course, is slavery. Talk a little bit about the relationship between Hortense and Felicité, Hortense being the mistress of the house.
Well, the Dupériers at one time had a lot of slaves, but in the country doing sugarcane. But here in town, it's like the shadows. They had just household servants here in town at the Dupérier house, and one of them was Felicité. But was she their slave? She's not in the records of the Dupériers' successions. So I couldn't really prove even that she was a slave. But the story is that when the yellow fever epidemic broke out, her mother had been a healer, and she did use Haitian methods. And the doctors were treating yellow fever with withholding water, leeches, bleeding, and people died of dehydration. And she did not believe in that. She believed in different things. And Mrs. Dupérier, Hortense Dupérier, gave her a free hand to use her own methods on their slaves, and they survived. So, what was I talking about?
About slavery.
Slavery, okay. So, but Hortense Dupérier was widowed, and her husband had tremendous debts, and almost everything had to be sold off. But she had only one strong male slave left, and that was Jacques. And she had Felicité, whether she was a slave or not, we don't know. She had Felicité. But out of necessity, they became close, all three of them. Hortense needed a man in the house to do the physical work of that household. She had 3 children. She had animals. Her family was around, but they couldn't come and do all the things that needed to be done. So she needed she needed Jacques, she needed a man. So born of necessity, they became closer than slaves often were. And when the yellow fever struck and Felicité was willing to nurse first Hortense's friends And then the entire town, they were a team that traveled through this entire town and nursed using the old ways, and their patients were surviving. So I guess it's necessity. They had a need for each other. And Hortense was very lonely, of course. She was living in that big, not big compared to what's there now, but what was then a big house by herself with just Felicité and 2 other people to help her. I think out of need for each other, they became closer than usual. But I do have many incidences in the story to show that it was never the bond of 2 people of the same race.
Do you think she's reluctant to sell Jacques just because he's of help to her?
Yes.
Or because they become friends?
They've become friends, but I think it's more the help than anything else. She just had so much to manage and very little money. I mean, in those days, you couldn't go hire somebody to help you. People either had slaves or they did on their own.
Do you think that's how they justified slavery?
Many ways they justified it. That was one reason, one way. And of course, the ranchers thought they were good, and it was the sugar farmers who were terrible to their slaves. And the ranchers felt, because the ranchers didn't need help, all that. They could mostly do their own ranching with maybe 1 or 2 people to help them, whereas a sugar operation took huge numbers of slaves. Yeah. So they criticized they said, all the problems are just those sugar farmers. You know, you can always find somebody else to blame all the problems on, right? Well, they blamed it all on the sugar farmers. And the ranchers were mostly French descendants, and they said, it's those English people coming down here and setting up the big sugar farmers. Yeah. It's their problem. Slavery was always somebody else's problem, but I'm going to be fine because I only need 1 or 2, and they're happy. I mean, this painting by Jerome Weber is, you're going to be my poster, David? Okay.
Thank you.
And see, then it was red brick, didn't have the white stone on it. That was the main house. Then there was a cistern, there was a plantation bell, and this was the overseer's house. And back here comes Henry Street, and across that was the slave quarters. But the overseer had a house, see, and then the slaves, the overseer, and the owners there.
Yeah. Yeah. Another theme that really caught my interest was the role of women in this story. It runs throughout the entire novel, the responsibilities of women and what is expected of them in the role they played in society. Comment a little bit about that.
Of course, women were not legal persons. Men did everything. Men made all the decisions. Women couldn't buy or sell anything. When Felicité became a widow, when her husband, Frederick de Perrier, died, the men in the family, that is the husbands of the various family members, all got together, and they were the ones who made the decisions about what was going to be sold and what was going to happen, and what Felicité what Hortense was going to be able to keep. She had to sit in another room and pay no attention, and she had to take what they did. So women were, starting with the law, they had no position where they made decisions of their own. They couldn't do anything except with their husband's permission. Then they also were expected to be a certain type of person. They were supposed to embroider and tat and all this and not do anything. Now, actually running a household was a difficult job, and they were quite challenged keeping it going, and that was just fine with the men as long as they stayed in the kitchen, and did it. But their position was pretty bad as far as making decisions for themselves. They were, in a way, like slaves.
And back to Jacques, it was the men who decided to sell Jacques over her objection, but she really had no say in the matter, although he belonged to her, supposedly.
Yes.
Another theme that's really interesting to me in the book is the closeness of families and how interdependent they were. And this family in particular, because the man of the household was gone, making Hortense dependent on other members of the family to make decisions for her, but also to help with the children and with travel and with shopping and certainly with the disease that came around. So talk a little bit about the family.
Okay, who else could you call on? I mean, there was no, this was a frontier. There was no government. There was no police. There was no, you couldn't call up Home Instead and get help to help you when you got old. It was the family, and they swarmed in and helped when they had to. That was your resource, was your family. And I think that set the tone that has never left this area. People stayed and they kept their ways, and the family is still extremely important here. Of course, fortunately, we can also supplement what our family does for us with what we can hire done. But in those days, there wasn't anything there. And that's why you just had to have the family pitch in and do it.
Can you put up the genealogy of the family?
Yeah, let's see.
It's in there somewhere.
Yep.
There
we are.
Yeah.
Everybody's name begins with B. Here we have Frederick de Perrier and Hortense. They were the owners of that house. And the maternal line was in New Iberia, and the paternal line was in St. Martin. And they traveled the bayou, visiting the St. Martin group. And they traveled the bayou in New Iberia from those that lived on down East Main to the de Perrier house, because the roads were virtually non-existent. They were muddy most of the time. I mean, can you imagine if we had nothing but, think of all we complain about our roads now. Imagine if they were mud.
Yeah.
It was better to go on the water than to deal with the mud to get from place to place.
Yeah. Not to mention the wild animals that might cross the road.
Yes.
I remember there's one incident with a snake. And
there were a lot of snakes, and one with a bear.
Yeah, you're right. Let's talk a little bit about the craft of the novel. You chose to write it in first person with Hortense telling the story. How did you come to that choice?
Well, I mean, I thought about writing it from Felicité, and as a matter of fact, one of the early readers of the story was disappointed. She felt that was a defect of the novel, that I didn't write in the voice of Felicité herself. Because then we could have had much more about Felicité's life, probably born in Haiti, come to New Orleans, be sold. All of that would be very interesting. But there is a general feeling today that people of color don't want their stories told by someone from a different culture. And that actually was a good idea to me, because to write, you have to live these characters. And it's pretty hard for a privileged white woman to really know the feelings of a black slave. I think it worked out okay by trying to show Felicité show what she did and how she did it, to hear what she had to say about it and how she related to everybody else. But to presume to take her voice, I thought was too much. I agreed with that, the current view that you don't write in another culture.
Yeah. One of the tricky parts of writing fiction is displaying a character's personality through the way they speak. And I was impressed with the way your different characters have different speech patterns, different ways of expressing themselves. For example, the children do not sound like the adults. Some of them speak a little French, and some don't. But how did you distinguish in the dialogue something about the character of the person speaking?
My technique on writing in creating a child's character is to decide on their personality, that whether that this child is going to be shy, that this one is going to be rambunctious, this one's going to be very forward. And then when it's time for that child to do something, I try to be what that child, the shy child, would look down, would speak more softly. I tried to make that child live by being that child with that personality. It worked better for me to do that than description and say, this one has blue eyes, and so every time the child comes, somebody has to say, oh, what wonderful blue eyes you have. I did better making the personality of the child, making the child act and speak in a certain personality. And then each one has a different personality. And so now the adults, I did some of that, but I did more on their conversation, the way we'd write anybody's conversation. But I have to admit that my great-grandchildren are in this book because, Hortense was a creative child. She kept diaries, and actually the diaries were found, and that's true. And she had written it when she was a child. She wrote fanciful stories. Well, I have a great-grandchild who's very creative, and he doesn't write yet, but he gets into a costume and has to act out everything that you see. And so I put his personality into that child. That's what I try to do, is to find somebody that I know that's like that and have them act and speak like that. Like in the book, I have her when she's little and has to take care of her younger brothers. She puts chairs up in a row and pretends it's a boat, and she says, "We're going. Yeah, now we're going to get on the bayou and we're going to go here." And well, I saw Leo do that. So
the novel is divided into 3 parts, and the first and the third parts are with Hortense as an adult, but the middle part is pictures her as a child. And we see, well, first of all, let me ask, why did you decide to divide it into 3 parts structurally?
I don't know.
Well, my fiction writer friends tell me that they often do things they did not anticipate doing because the characters make them do it. The characters take on a life of their own, and they become personalities that shape the fiction itself. In that middle section, Hortense is a child, and we see much of the countryside through her eyes. Tell us a little bit about what she notices as she's riding in a wagon from their home into St. Martinville or somewhere.
She is observant, and well, one time she sees a bear, and her father has to shoot over the bear. Wouldn't shoot the bear, but shoot over the bear to drive it off, and it's scary. And then another time they go past a sugarcane field, and she sees an overseer with a whip, and that affects her. But she see that it just seemed nothing was natural to her, so she would be surprised when she'd see something like that, whereas probably the adults had seen that many times. So that was why I picked a child to see some of those things that I wanted to illustrate.
Yeah. And I wondered about the names. Some of them were historically provided, but how did you come up with the names for characters who were not
Mostly
named?
From church records. I looked to see who witnessed their baptisms and witnessed their marriages, what were common names to use. And of course, the last names came off maps mostly. There was a time when the wall behind my computer was papered with maps of this area, like that one I showed you, and lists of things of people that I had seen, various family members that I had seen that had ancestors in St. Martin or that had ancestors in Nouvelle-Iberie, then. And I had lists I would pick the names off the maps too.
Mm-hmm. I was struck by them because they do seem right for the period, and they're not names that are always commonly popular today. So, well, we have a little time left over, so I would open the floor to any questions you might want to. Oh, good, we have questions. Yes, sir.
Well, we are so fortunate this afternoon to have 2 Anns.
But she's Anne with an E.
Yes. Your research went over a number of decades, and I'm just curious on another subject. Did you find records of storms, of hurricanes that are recorded or noted?
Well, of course, Ile Dernière is the big storm of that era, and Alfred de Perrier's wife, Emma Meal, Alfred was a doctor. Let's see, Hortense and Frederick had 3 children, and the oldest one, Alfred, was a doctor. And his wife, they went to Ile Dernière in the summertime as a vacation spot to get out of the heat, and they thought they were getting away from yellow fever. And Emma Meal, her family did also. They came from Plaquemine area. And when the storm came, he rescued her and then later married her, and she came back. That was the big storm. Yeah. We have a lot more of them now.
Thank you.
Yes, in
Yeah.
the back.
Two real basic questions. How did Frederick die?
Frederick, a natural death. It was probably good living.
And then where was the bayou home? How far down the bay?
Let's see. I know it when I see it. It's set back on the bayou side. I can't give you
Close to this side of Lewis or the other side?
the other side.
Yes, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
other
I'm
side.
trying to figure out how far down they go. Thank you.
Yeah.
How many people knew the story of Felicité before the book? Everybody. Okay, that's what I figured.
Yeah, I mean, it's just everybody knows it around here, but I think I found out who she. Okay. Francois César Boudy is Hortense's uncle. And I looked at all these documents, and of course they never had Felicité's name in them, or none of these people had. You see, the horror of someone being property turned out to be the way to find the person, because I finally found in Francois César Boudy's succession in the basement of the Iberville Parish Courthouse, because he happened to die in Iberville Parish, this crumbling document, and it listed in his succession sale, the son, Francois César Boudy Fils, F-I-L-S, or Junior, was left a slave named Felicité. And I was able to convince myself that this is our Felicité, because the lore that was in the family of like when Hortense's father died, and her mother was left with a family to raise, somebody gave to the family Felicité. And who would that be? I think it was somebody in that Boudy family who did that. But even though Francois César Boudy Fils got Felicité in the succession, he didn't pay the price for her. So probably they had to come up with the money to get her. Anyway, I explained it all in the thing, but anyway, she was a slave, but she wasn't the DePerrier's slave. She was the Boudy's slave. And Francois César Boudy Jr. had financial problems. You know that from looking at the records of the 20 years that followed that. Someone was always suing him and he was always in trouble. So probably they didn't want to rock the boat by getting Felicité's real status, because the creditors would have come in and taken her. She was an asset.
Oh, yeah.
So better just to, lay quiet. And that's why I think she was never freed by the Duperriers, because she was a slave, but she wasn't theirs to free. And if they'd rocked the boat and told the world who she really was, the slave who enslaved her, the creditors would have come in and taken her.
Yeah.
And
I think we have another question.
that's my story.
Yeah, I'm just curious how you came up with the name for the book and what the meaning behind all of it.
Well, yellow jack is what they called yellow fever. That's what people of color called yellow fever, was yellow jack. So this is the year of the big yellow jack fever. And the slaves referred to it always as yellow jack. No one wanted to say the word yellow fever. That was, they were afraid to say it. There was a taboo on that. You say it, you might get it. But to me, it was fascinating that they did not know where it came from. And so they were in New Iberia. And William Burke, that's the ancestor of the Burkes we all know, he died. Salvatore Miguez out in the country dies. Then Dr. Neal, who's around here in town, he dies. These people didn't know each other or see each other, and yet they all got it. So they were, so the people that thought about this said, you can't be getting it from another person, because these people never saw each other. But people had all kind of theories. That one of the theories was that it came on a steamboat in a cask where someone had put a body in rum, and you've heard that story?
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. Did you run across that?
Oh yeah, ran across all kinds of theories, and that one of the slaves broke into there to drink the rum and got it and brought it back to the plantation. Well, that one was easy to run down because
The story I heard, he didn't get out. He drowned. Whatever. The body was in. No.
I think it's just Hortense ran that story down. She went to the plantation and nobody had yellow fever over there. So, it was just all not true at all.
Never happened.
And then somebody died, and Duperrier gave the property for the St. Peter's Church. So one of the first funerals held there was somebody who died of yellow fever, and they carried him across the street to the cemetery, and the people who carried the casket got yellow fever. So then it was, it's coming from out of the casket. I mean, they thought all this stuff. They know. And a lot of the family stories believed different versions of this. I wrote the most wonderful chapter on the Haitian Revolution. I hated to throw that away. But I mean, a lot of the stuff I wrote and then said, no, that didn't work. That didn't work at all. No, that didn't work because of this, and that didn't work because of that. Penny has a ring that she claimed that her family, some members of her family, think came from Jean Lafitte, because which one was it now? It was a Berard. One of the Berards dressed up as Jean Lafitte at a Mardi Gras ball, and everyone was furious about that because they really thought he was Jean Lafitte. I don't know these, but a lot of these stories, when I got this version that I think is the true story, a lot of you find out the origin of a lot of these stories and why they passed down, because there was a time when there was this feud in the family all about because somebody dressed as Jean Lafitte and they were embarrassed about it and said it was terrible. Anyway, we have a question.
I'm curious, when you were saying that they traveled on the bayou, what kind of boat did they travel in?
Yeah, well, they were not fancy boats, but they were, kind of like barges that they traveled in. But they
So would they paddle or would
paddled.
they pole?
They both. They didn't have any one kind of boat, and they certainly were not fancy.
Something utilitarian. Something practical, something probably multi-use.
Yeah. And the wagons too. There was no one kind of wagon. They were all different kind of handmade kind of things.
Bernard wagon.
Yeah.
We have a question here.
I recently heard it was a doctor who practiced in West Texas, I think, where he grew up like from the 1900s until he died in 1980. And someone asked him what was the most significant thing that happened that changed society, and he said in his lifetime, and he said screen windows. That was the most significant development that occurred in his lifetime. So, like for us, maybe it would be computers, or I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But like doing all of that historical research, what do you think was the most significant social revolution, or what was the most significant thing that happened that impacted New Iberia and all of these families? Maybe it was the
Steamboat. Well,
Steamboat?
steamboat.
Okay.
That made a big difference. And steam power. I mean, it changed the way they operated sugarcane, changed the way the boats. The steamboats came up the bayou Teche and turned right at the DePerrier house, because across the street at Pintard's Tavern, which also the DePerriers owned, and into the DePerriers, the bayou. I have maps of it. The bayou has a big hole in it there because they couldn't go on to St. Martinville. The bayou wasn't cleared out enough for boats to go on to St. Martinville. So they turned around and went back. And that's why Pintard's Tavern made money and the DePerriers made money, because they were resupplied at Pintard's Tavern right there across from the DePerriers.
We have another right here.
What was the time period? And in terms of the yellow fever, was that happening all across the state of Louisiana all at the same time?
No, there were outbreaks in New Orleans almost every summer, but there were probably 3 that were significant here. But this is the one that almost wiped the town off, because the town DePerrier had just gotten the papers for New Iberia to be a town, and then all of a sudden everybody's sick. I mean, it could have wiped New Iberia off the map if Felicité had not saved it, Felicité and Hortense. And one theme that I loved is these two women, Hortense, who grew up as the privileged matron, had to embroider and tat and all this. She broke out of her when she was widowed, she broke out of her traditional role. And Felicité broke out of her traditional role and took on going with Hortense all over this town. So these two women both broke down barriers and changed themselves and saved the town.
And the year?
1839.
So why did Hortense not get all bigger?
Don't know. The reason Felicité was able to do this, she probably had it as a child. But Hortense never got it. Of course, the fear in town was terrible. It began with a terrible headache. So then everybody, anybody who got a headache, and everyone thought, "Oh, I've got a headache." That's
Yeah.
We all did that recently with COVID, didn't we?
I did think about that a lot.
We're about out of time. You might want to run through your slides. Are there any that we didn't see?
I think not, but let's see. I'll go
There's
back.
Felicité's grave.
That's their world. You can see Fosse Point there and up. And Sharonton is where the first settlement was that moved up to become New Iberia. And so they had to go all through that to get anywhere. Let's see. We did that one. And so let's see. I think that's it. Oh, and her grave. That's fascinating too, because it was very unusual for a slave to be buried with the family. So that made people think she wasn't a slave. But that's her.
Where is that?
Okay. Yeah, St. Peter's. And that's her grave. This is Frederick de Perrier. And there's something in one of those letters that says that she's buried beneath the book. This is an open book. And actually her gravestone was on the other side, and just recently it's been put there because that's considered probably where she was buried.
Yeah.
And the day that she was buried, there was an article about it in the New York Times. And Glenn Conrad said, an exaggeration. Like, it said that the whole town shut down and everybody went. He said that wasn't true. I don't know. I mean, lots of the stories can be thrown away. Most of the stories can be thrown away.
But they're still good stories.
They're still good stories. That's another thing that interests me, is what is the value of family lore? What does it take for family lore to be worth it? If one story shows up in 5 different places, does that make it more likely to have happened?
Or is it just a good story?
Is it just a good story?
Right.
One thing I think it does do is give you a sense, even if the facts are not correct, it gives you a sense of what it was like to live then. There's no doubt about that, because what that person who got the Booker Prize says about historical fiction, which is now my favorite stuff to read and to write, is that what it does is it gives you a sense of what it was like to exist at that moment. history is facts, and the best history, really puts the facts together in a fascinating way and uses the facts to interpret what people were really thinking. But historical fiction is how you felt, and I think how it felt to live in that time. Yeah. And I think that the stories are what does that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good note to end on.